Hello, I'm Nancy Furness, and I'm here with the Wondrous Tree Fellowship. We're at MLA Mike Farnworth's office in Port Coquitlam, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Coquitlam First Nations. We're here today to celebrate an event called Lost Species Day. And this is a time when we can take some time to reflect on all of the species we've lost due to extinction, make a promise to protect those species that are currently at risk and threatened, and also to celebrate the wonderful diversity that we still have in British Columbia. So today I'm joined by Charlotte Daw from the Wilderness Committee, and I would like to welcome you, Charlotte, and we look forward to hearing some more about what the Wilderness Committee is doing to work on species at risk legislation. So, Charlotte, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why biodiversity is important. Why do we care?
I think this question can be answered in two ways. We can think about how biodiversity benefits us, and we exist within these ecosystems, the same ecosystems that support all other species. So when we think about biodiversity, the diversity of all life on Earth, we're part of that. So selfishly, we can think that we need the trees to sequester carbon. We need the underground microorganisms to decompose and create healthy soil that we can grow our food. We need pollinators to grow our crops and pollinate our crops. And so selfishly, we can think of all those reasons why biodiversity directly supports us and keeps us alive. But I like to use and think about the other way is just our responsibility to protect the diversity of all life on Earth. A lot of these species are going extinct because of us. And so it's our responsibility to save them, I think, regardless of their benefits to us. So that's kind of my answer for that one.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think one thing that we're just starting to do now is to connect those dots. Locally, we have a species at risk called the Oregon forest snail. And it's on site at Colony Farm, which is the site of the TMX pipeline construction area. And I was wondering, can you tell us about some more species, both locally and in BC, that are at risk right now?
Yeah, I think one of the species that are the most at risk in BC is the spotted owl. Right now there's one breeding pair left and one juvenile in the wild. And that's years of inaction of the BC government in allowing old growth logging of their habitat to an extent that has dropped the population from 500 breeding pairs to one in a matter of decades. We also have southern mountain caribou, was once the most widespread ungulate throughout all of Canada, and those herds are just now isolated pockets that are barely hanging on. We all know about salmon, the various salmon species that are facing extinction. So there's a long list.
In the news a lot lately is Fairy Creek. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about that. Why is it so important that we protect Fairy Creek as far as ecosystems and species at risk goes, as well as, of course, logging the ancient growth?
Old growth forests harbor species that can't live anywhere else. The species evolved to live in these big old trees. Marbled murrelet have their nests on the branches of these moss-covered, huge branches of moss-covered old-growth trees. They can't live anywhere else. They kind of fly in goofily and they sort of torpedo in and boom, land on the branch, and like they've evolved in that ecosystem. And so when we take that away, they really have nowhere else to go. Fairy Creek also is home to the western screech owl, the specklebelly lichen, like I said, marbled murrelet as well, northern goshawk. These are all species that are at risk. And regardless of all of these species being there and us knowing they're there, habitat destruction continued on because we don't have a law that can actually protect their habitat, which is pretty bizarre.
So if there are no laws currently in place provincially to protect our species at risk, how are they being protected? What protection can we offer them?
I can give you the example of Fairy Creek, which I think is a really good microcosm example of how extinction happens. So In BC, we do have the Canadian federal law that also applies. So it's called the Canadian Species at Risk Act. One of the biggest issues with this act is it only automatically applies to federal land. So that means unless a species is located in a national park, a military base, a post office, something that is considered federal land, they don't automatically get protected. So, when Fairy Creek happened and, we sent biologists out to document over 300 countings of marbled murrelet flying into a forest that was about to be logged. And, people ask me, well, what can we do? What about the Federal Species at Risk Act? And I said, it literally doesn't automatically apply here. So they get zero protection. And it's all based on the fact if the minister wants to stand up and sort of like use his emergency powers to step in. And of course, they don't. The minister has only done that 2 times in the history of the law. And so really, we have these species that just, regardless of the fact that they're endangered, regardless of the fact we know they're living there, their habitat gets green-lighted for destruction anyways, because we don't have a law that protects them on provincial land.
Okay, thank you. And can you share with us what the Wilderness Committee's vision would be for species protection in BC? What would you like to see happen? And also, how can people get involved to support your efforts?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that question. I think so. Our vision is better planning. When we think about the biodiversity crisis, I think a lot of people feel helpless in it, like it's just a fact of life and it's just due to how we live and there's nothing we can do about it. But that's not true. The same way that saving old growth forests is as simple as banning old growth logging, saving species at risk is as simple as having a law to protect them. If we can have a law to protect them, it means every single activity that causes extinction would go through another filter and another lens that decides if this project is acceptable. And if the outcome of this project is going to contribute to the extinction of a species, ultimately we have to start saying no to those types of projects. We haven't ever lived in a society since colonization here that accurately thinks about the impacts that we have to the species here around us, and I think we need to start today. So that's one of our visions, is obviously this law that would give species that beginning step of protection before it gets so bad. And then if people do want to get involved, we're going to be really ramping up this campaign, putting the pressure on MLAs, putting the pressure on John Horgan. And, he actually promised us a law in 2017. So we're going to make him remember that promise. And if you guys want to get involved, you can head over to wildernesscommittee.org and then navigate to our Species at Risk work, and then you can find all of the information there.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that. And again, we're at MLA Mike Farnworth's office in Port Coquitlam, and we're calling on MLA Farnworth to enact species at risk legislation now. So thank you, Charlotte, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves.
We're continuing our Lost Species Day action today, and we're now at MLA Finn Donnelly's office in Coquitlam. So I'd like to thank Finn for joining us today, and I'm just going to start with a question. If you could explain to us, Finn, a little bit about what role salmon play in the ecosystem.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. Really, species are incredibly important, and British Columbia is one of the most rich provinces in the country, and really in North America. This is a very rich area for species, animals and plant life. So salmon, for instance, which is in my mandate as Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture, I am mandated to focus on salmon, as well as other fisheries species. But salmon are incredibly important, as you mentioned. They play a vital role not only for coastal communities and livelihoods, but also in the ecosystem. They feed all sorts of animals. They feed the forests in British Columbia. We live in a temperate rainforest, and and they add nitrogen to the forests, and that is fed to the forest through so many different animals, whether it's salmon in the, birds in the sky, bears on the ground, other animals that pull the salmon carcasses when they spawn up the banks and into the forest. They get into the soil, and that really becomes part of the forest ecosystem. So they are a tremendous nitrogen loader of our forests in British Columbia. So they're critical. They play a key role economically. They play a key role culturally. They've been a central role for Indigenous cultures for millennia. They play a key role in coastal communities. That's dwindling because of management practices or bad management practices. And they also play just a key role in just who we are as British Columbians.
Well, thank you for that. As you clearly outlined, salmon are an iconic species for British Columbia. And right now, some of our wild salmon populations are really at high risk. Can you tell us a little bit about why they're at high risk, and also maybe talk a little bit about the flooding, the effects of the current flooding on the salmon populations and what the consequences might be?
Yeah, absolutely. Salmon are a complicated species because they spawn in freshwater habitat, which is really provincial jurisdiction. They head out going through a myriad of issues and challenges, and then they go out into the ocean, which is federal jurisdiction and First Nation jurisdiction. They head out into other countries' jurisdiction, into the wild ocean, the high seas, and then they return and they have to face again a whole gauntlet, a range of threats and challenges, returning back to their natal streams to spawn, which is really a miracle that they get back to the same place often to spawn. So they are facing, and they have faced over a number of centuries, and now specifically over the last 50 years, a myriad of challenges that have really brought them down, and the trends unfortunately are going down in many populations in the province. So why is that? I think it's due to management issues. I think we cannot let that go. It's we're catching too many, and over the years, and that's based on our management of salmon and the predictions of them returning. On top of that, we have global warming, or as it's been popularized, climate change. So we have a change in climate. It's warming up. It's warming those streams up, making it extremely hard for salmon to return. There's pollution, all sorts of pollution in the rivers, in the receiving waters, from all kinds of human inputs. And then there's habitat destructions from all kinds of impacts, whether it's forestry, mining, agriculture, urban development, you name it. There's a plethora of impacts called cumulative impacts that salmon are facing. Now on top of that, we've just had this rain event, calling it an atmospheric river, just a huge volume of water that has come down in a short period of time, 2 days, and has exacerbated the creeks and rivers and the big river systems, and impacted them in specific ways, like just the volume of water has taken out the gravel and washed the salmon beds out. So when salmon are spawning right now, those eggs could be washed out or buried. So we won't know the full extent of the flooding damage probably for months, maybe even for years to come when we see the returns. But we know there's been tremendous damage to many of the creeks and rivers, the spawning grounds of salmon, right? Not only just in the lower Fraser here, Fraser Valley, but in many other interior salmon rivers as well.
Yeah, it sounds like it really is a species in crisis. And you were saying that there's so many challenges that they face, and one of those challenges is being overseen by different levels of governance. And I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about, as your role as MLA, what are you doing to protect the salmon, or what can you do to protect the salmon?
Well, it's a great question. I mentioned it's a complicated jurisdiction, and as fisheries and Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture, the Premier has dedicated my role now as an important role of the provincial government. This is generally seen as a federal responsibility, but Premier Horgan has seen that the province can play a very important role in reviving and revitalizing wild salmon. So that is the first thing, is just acknowledging that the province has a role. And as parliamentary secretary, I've been mandated to look at revitalizing wild salmon, bringing in a watershed security, or working with my colleagues on a watershed security strategy and fund, looking at biodiversity strategies, specifically from a salmon perspective. So there's a number of tools that we're working on to focus on bringing wild salmon back. Probably the most important focus for me right now is a wild salmon recovery strategy. And because it involves working with the province or the federal government and First Nations, my number one task is trying to work with the new Minister of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Joyce Murray, as well as First Nation leadership, to come together to create one coordinated and integrated wild salmon recovery strategy for the province. So that's my number one focus, is let's get together, let's put all of our resources, combine all of our resources into one plan, and let's figure out the jurisdiction, figure out all of those myriad of challenges and threats, figure out how we can bring the resources that each, the federal government, the provincial government, and First Nation leadership can bring to the solution, and let's work together and give salmon a fighting chance.
So what actions can your constituents take to help you fight to protect our salmon?
It's really important that we acknowledge the role that stream keepers and stewardship organizations that care so deeply about salmon and the ecosystem and watersheds. They have played a real role where government has been absent over the years. They've stepped in. They shouldn't have to, but they have. And many of them have volunteered their time, donated money, and we thank them for that amazing contribution. What they can do right now is continue to put pressure on people like me, MLAs that are focused on bringing back salmon, on the federal government, so their local MPs, and draw it right to your MLA, right to your MP. Tell them how important salmon are and what are they going to do about it, and really ask for specifics, timelines, and commitments, political will, and what kind of resources can the province, the federal government bring to the table. It's really important to continue to do that because, as you know, governments are continually asked to do a whole range of things. Now, this, and we said off the top, this is the third state of emergency that this province is suffering. We're now looking at the flood victims that are going to need a lot of money and resources to help those farms recover, and many people that were impacted by those floods and the mudslides. We also had a wildfire, a state of emergency earlier this year in the summer. Those people are going to need support. So the whole town of Lytton was eviscerated. It's going to need some resources to rebuild. And then also we're still in a COVID, a global pandemic. So the people and the families and the businesses that are needing to recover also need resources. So all of these resources need tax dollars, but so do salmon. So we need to hear your voices. We need to hear you speaking out to say this is important, that please, provincial government, federal government, First Nation governments, respond and dedicate the resources that are needed, dedicate the people, the staff that it's going to take to figure this out, and let's get on the path of recovering our wild salmon.
Well, thank you so much, Finn, for taking time to talk to us today and tell us about what you're doing and what we can do to help protect salmon. As you said, we've had a series of really critical incidences happening. We had the heat dome, the fires, the floods. We also have a biodiversity crisis, which is going on as well. So we appreciate your work, and we encourage your constituents to get in touch with you and to let them know that they care about salmon too. So thank you very much.